I want to talk about the Serbian front of the First World War, and I'll be honest with you, I came across this story properly for the first time about a year ago when I was reading about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and stumbled into a set of casualty statistics that genuinely stopped me. I had to put the book down and go back and read them again because I thought I had misread something. I hadn't. France lost 16.8% of its mobilized soldiers in the First World War. Germany lost 15.4%, Russia 11.5%. These are the numbers we talk about when we talk about the scale of this war. And then Serbia? Serbia lost 25% of every soldier it put in the field, a quarter of its entire army dead, and that is before we count the civilians, which we will because the civilian death toll in Serbia was somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people out of a pre-war population of 4.5 million. Depending on which estimates you use, Serbia lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its entire population in this war. I find it extraordinary not just because of the scale, but because almost nobody in the English-speaking world knows it happened. You can consider yourself a serious student of the First World War. You can have read widely and watched documentaries and visited the memorials at Thiepval and Tyne Cot, and still have almost no idea what happened to Serbia between 1914 and 1918. I think that's a genuine injustice to the people who went through it, and I think the reason it's happened is actually quite specific. The Serbian story doesn't fit the shape that Western war memory is comfortable with. It doesn't end in a victory parade with crowds cheering in the streets. It goes through something called the Albanian Golgotha, a retreat through winter mountains that killed more people than many of the famous battles of the Western Front, and it ends at a battle most people have never heard of, that military historians are increasingly convinced ended the entire war. I want to tell this story properly because what happened to Serbia between 1914 and 1918 was one of the most extreme experiences any nation has been put through in modern military history, and the men and women who carried it deserve to be known. This is what happened. Serbia had already fought 2 major wars in the 2 years before the First World War began. The First Balkan War of 1912 and the Second Balkan War of 1913 had driven the Ottoman Empire out of its remaining European territories and then set the Balkan states against each other over how to divide the gains. By August 1914, the Serbian army was not a fresh peacetime force. It was a formation that had been in almost continuous combat for 2 years, that had taken significant casualties and not fully replaced them, that was equipped with weapons and ammunition it had been consuming for 2 years without adequate resupply. The men who would fight the First World War were men who had already survived 2 other wars. Some of them had been fighting since 1912. The Kingdom of Serbia itself was a small country. Its pre-war population was approximately 4.5 million people. Its army, fully mobilized, could field approximately 450,000 soldiers, though the figure of 400,000 is more commonly cited for the force that actually took the field in August 1914. It had no heavy industry to speak of, no domestic arms production that could supply a sustained modern war, and allies whose nearest forces were accessible only through Greece. What it had was a military tradition forged over decades of conflict, soldiers who had been fighting in the mountains and river valleys of the Balkans since childhood, and a specific quality of obstinate endurance in the face of overwhelming odds that would define the entire Serbian experience of the war. Before the guns of August 1914 had been firing for 2 weeks, the Serbian front had already produced the first aerial dogfight in history, the first Allied victory of the war, and a military upset that would define the relationship between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the remainder of the conflict. Austria-Hungary had gone to war expecting to defeat Serbia in weeks. What it got instead was an education conducted at enormous cost in the specific quality of what a small country fighting for its existence is capable of. The war began because of Serbia. This is worth stating clearly because the standard Western account of how the First World War started tends to move quickly past the Serbian dimension and into the European alliance system and the Schlieffen Plan and the race to mobilize. The immediate trigger was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb. Austria-Hungary blamed the Serbian government, presented an intentionally unacceptable ultimatum on July 23rd, declared war on July 28th when Serbia accepted most but not all of the demands, and bombarded Belgrade on July 29th. That bombardment of Belgrade was the first military action of the First World War, and the man who had been responsible for security arrangements in Sarajevo on the day of the assassination, the man who had refused to call out additional troops to protect Franz Ferdinand because their uniforms were dirty from that morning's military exercises, was the same man who would command the Austrian forces in the first 3 invasions of Serbia in 1914. His name was General Oskar Potirek. He failed at Sarajevo on June 28th, and he failed in Serbia 3 times in the following 6 months, and the connection between those 2 failures is one of the specific human ironies of a war that produced many of them. The Austrian plan was to knock Serbia out quickly. Konrad von Hötzendorf, the Austrian chief of staff, had publicly boasted before the war that it would take 3 months to defeat Serbia. The diplomats in Vienna were drawing up plans for what they called a punitive expedition, a brief, decisive military operation that would crush Serbian military resistance and eliminate Serbia as an independent threat to Austro-Hungarian stability in the Balkans. What they had not adequately considered was the quality of the army they were sending to conduct this expedition, the quality of the army they were sending it against, and the specific military capacity of Oskar Potirek for operational disaster. On August 12, 1914, Austro-Hungarian forces crossed the Drina River and invaded Serbia. The force numbered approximately 200,000 men. The Serbian army, commanded by Field Marshal Radomir Putnik, was already in position. Putnik is one of the most remarkable military commanders of the First World War on any front, and he is almost entirely unknown outside Serbia. He was 67 years old in 1914. He had been fighting in Serbia's various conflicts since 1876. He was the first man to hold the rank of Field Marshal in the Serbian army. He was also, by August 1914, gravely ill. The specific quality of his illness is documented. He was nearly blind, he suffered from the severe bronchitis that repeatedly became pneumonia, and he was so physically frail that he could not visit the front and had to command his army from a heated room well behind the lines. There was a specific moment in the opening weeks of the war, when Austrian forces crossed the Drina and Sava rivers in different locations simultaneously, where Putnik had to calculate from a map in a warm room where the main Austrian effort was actually going, and commit the reserve formations of his army to respond to it. He got it right. He nearly always got it right. What he was right about in August 1914 was that the Austrian main effort was coming from the west, across the Drina, rather than from the north, across the Sava. He ordered his forces to concentrate against the western invasion. The Serbian Second Army under General Stepa Stepanovic was sent to reinforce the Third Army under General Pavle Jurisic Sturm, a man born in Germany who had attended the Prussian Military Academy and the French War Academy and had come to Serbia as a German officer in 1876 to volunteer in the Serbo-Turkish War, changed his name from Paul Sturm to Pavle Jurisic Sturm and never left, on a forced night march to the slopes of Ker Mountain. The night of August 15th to 16th, 1914, the Serbian troops came off the march and found Austro-Hungarian forces bivouacked on the mountain slopes. Neither side expected a night encounter. The Serbs caught some of the Austro-Hungarian troops asleep and went in with bayonets. The Battle of Ser lasted 9 days. By August 20th, the morale of the Austro-Hungarian Fifth Army had collapsed. What the Austrian journalist Erwin Kisch wrote in his eyewitness account of what he saw is one of the specific pieces of testimony from the Serbian front that deserves to be as well known as the accounts from the Western Front. Kisch wrote, "The army has been defeated and has found itself in a wild, reckless and panicky run. A defeated army? No. A broken mob, rushing in mindless terror toward the border. Those Serbs, they're great guys, they know how to defend their country." The Austro-Hungarian forces fled back across the Drina, thousands of them drowning in the river in the panic of the retreat. Serbian forces entered Sabak on August 24th, marking the end of the battle and the first Allied victory over the Central Powers in the entire First World War. The specific texture of the Battle of Ser reveals things about the Serbian army that no general description can convey. The night engagement on the slopes of Ser Mountain on August 15th to 16th was not a planned battle, but an encounter between a Serbian force coming off a night march and Austrian forces that had bivouacked on the mountain without adequate security. Some of the Austro-Hungarian troops were asleep when the Serbs arrived. The fighting in the dark on the mountain slopes in pouring rain that turned the ground to mud was exactly the kind of close-quarters combat in difficult terrain that Serbian soldiers had been fighting for 2 years already in the Balkan Wars. For the Austrian troops, many from the flat plains of Hungary or the cities of the Habsburg heartland, it was something for which peacetime manoeuvres had not prepared them. By morning, the Austrians had been driven from the Divača range. The Bosnian 3rd Regiment of the Austro-Hungarian force, attempting to restore the situation on August 18th, advanced towards Serbian positions in a manner that an eyewitness described with the specific disbelief of a man watching something he could not explain. The regiment advanced as on the practice field in overly thick formation, without seeking shelter, accompanied by a military band playing the Rakoczy March. The Serbian artillery and rifle fire decimated them. The regiment's commander was wounded, his replacement was wounded, and the formation broke. What had appeared as tactical confidence or recklessness, marching in parade formation into prepared defensive positions while a military band played, was, in retrospect, the expression of an army that had been told Serbia would fall quickly and had not yet been taught what that particular speed bump actually looked like. There is a footnote to Ser that most accounts miss. The first aerial dogfight in the history of warfare took place during this battle, when Serbian aviator Miodrag Tomic encountered an Austro-Hungarian aircraft while on a reconnaissance mission over enemy positions. The Austro-Hungarian pilot drew his revolver and fired at Tomic. Tomic escaped. Within several weeks, all Serbian and Austro-Hungarian aircraft had been fitted with machine guns. The first aerial combat in history happened over the first Allied victory in history, on a battlefield in Serbia, in August 1914, and almost no history of either aerial warfare or the First World War mentions it. Potiorek was not finished. Austria-Hungary launched a second invasion of Serbia in September 1914, and a third in November. The third, the Battle of Kolubara, is the one that matters most because it came closest to succeeding, and because the Serbian response to it produced the kind of military achievement that, had it happened on the Western Front, would have been celebrated for a century. By mid-November 1914, Potiorek's forces had driven the Serbs back to the Kolubara River. Serbian ammunition was running critically low. On November 29th, Belgrade was abandoned to the Austro-Hungarian Fifth Army. Potiorek, celebrating what appeared to be the imminent defeat of Serbia, appointed a man named Stjepan Sarkotic as the governor of the occupied country before the occupation had actually happened. Austrian soldiers were holding a military parade through the streets of Belgrade on the day the Serbian counterattack began. On December 2nd, 1914, Field Marshal Putnik ordered a full counterattack all along the front simultaneously. What happened next is documented in a specific detail that I find extraordinary. The aging king, Peter I of Serbia, 71 years old, nearly blind, a man who had stepped aside in June to let his son Prince Alexander rule as regent, took a rifle and walked to the front to fight alongside his soldiers. He did not do this as a symbolic gesture. He did it because the situation appeared hopeless, and because he believed that his presence at the front might be the thing that tipped the balance, and he was prepared to die if it was not. The Serbian soldiers who saw their king arrive at the front carrying a rifle described the effect in terms that are consistent across multiple accounts. It transformed the morale of men who had been retreating for weeks. The Austro-Hungarian forces were by this point dangerously overextended. Their supply lines were stretched, their units were tired. They had not fortified their positions because Potiorek believed the war was essentially over. The Serbian counterattack hit them before they were ready. By December 6th, the Austro-Hungarian Sixth Army was in retreat. Valjevo fell to the Serbs on December 8th. The Austro-Hungarians abandoned Belgrade between December 14th and 15th. The Serbs recaptured their capital the following day. What this victory cost Austria-Hungary is documented in a specific figure that deserves emphasis. The Austro-Hungarian Balkan Army Group in 1914 had engaged approximately 450,000 soldiers in the Serbian campaign. By the end of the year, it had lost approximately 224,500 of them, half the force in 3 failed invasions of a country a fraction of Austria-Hungary's size. The German general Erich Ludendorff, watching the Habsburg military performance with the contempt that the German High Command consistently felt for its Austrian ally, produced the specific phrase that has attached itself to this period of the war. Ali, ha, we are shackled to a corpse. Conrad had employed almost 400,000 troops against Serbia in 1914 alone, against 921,000 on the Russian front. Serbia, with a fraction of the military resources of Russia, was tying down a comparable proportion of Austro-Hungarian force. Then the Typhus came. The conditions in Serbia by the winter of 1914 to 1915 had created precisely the environment in which typhus spreads fastest. Large numbers of men in close proximity, inadequate sanitation, widespread louse infestation, insufficient food, insufficient shelter, and an overwhelmed medical system. The epidemic that began in late 1914 and peaked through the spring of 1915 has been described by epidemiologists as the worst typhus outbreak in world history up to that point. The New York Times estimated 150,000 deaths in 1915 alone. Of Serbia's approximately 350 physicians, remember this was a country of 4.5 million people, 126 died of typhus, 36% of the doctors gone of disease in a few months. The specific account of conditions that survives from this period comes from multiple sources, but the account of the hospital at Kragujevac captures what the numbers mean in human terms. There were 1,600 patients in a hospital designed for a fraction of that number. There were 2 surgeons and 8 nurses. Of the 42 medical staff who had been working at the hospital, only 3 remained free from infection. The rest were sick or dead. I want to spend a moment on the Scottish women's hospitals because the story of how they came to exist in Serbia is one of those specific moments from this war that I find genuinely infuriating every time I come back to it. Dr. Elsie Inglis was a Scottish surgeon and suffragette who in August 1914 offered the British War Office a complete field hospital unit, staffed entirely by women. The War Office's response was delivered by a male official who told her, "My good lady, go home and sit still." She did not go home and sit still. She took her hospital units to Serbia, France, Russia and Romania, working continuously until her health gave out completely. She set up 14 field hospitals in Serbia alone, including 4 specifically for typhus cases. She was captured by the Austrians when they occupied Serbia in 1915 and was eventually repatriated, only to immediately volunteer for service in Russia and Romania. She died of cancer on November 26, 1917, still in service. She had been working for 3 years without adequate rest on the front lines of multiple theatres of the war. The British War Office's assessment of what she was good for, delivered in August 1914, was go home and sit still. They were wrong in every particular. The Austrian occupation that followed the 1915 collapse is something I don't think most people who know the Western Front story have any awareness of at all, and it's important. The Austrian military command issued orders that the laws of war regarding civilian populations were to be applied with maximum severity to a population it characterized as hostile and not entitled to the normal protections of occupied territory. The specific figures are disputed, as all atrocity figures from the period are disputed, but the documented minimum includes tens of thousands of Serbian civilians executed during the occupation period, with higher estimates running into the hundreds of thousands. What is not disputed is this scale of destruction. By the time Serbian forces returned to their country at the end of the war, entire villages had been erased. The population of Serbia in 1921 was approximately 30% lower than the pre-war population. The difference between what demographic projection would have predicted and what actually existed consisting of the dead, the permanently disabled, and those who had simply never returned from wherever the war had scattered them. The 114,000 Serbian war invalids who were alive at the end of the war had to rebuild their lives in a country whose infrastructure had been systematically dismantled. While Serbia was fighting the typhus epidemic, the diplomatic situation was shifting in ways that would produce the greatest military crisis the country had yet faced. Bulgaria, which had fought Serbia in the Second Balkan War of 1913 and had territorial grievances about the outcome, was being courted by both sides. The Central Powers offered it more. On October 6, 1915, a combined German and Austro-Hungarian force under Field Marshal August von Mackensen attacked Serbia from the north. On October 14th, Bulgaria declared war and attacked from the east. Serbia was now fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously against a combined force of over 600,000 soldiers. The exhausted, typhus-depleted Serbian army had approximately 250,000 men to oppose them. France and Britain had landed at Salonika in Greece in October, but they could not advance north in time. The arithmetic was final. Putnik conducted a series of skilled fighting retreats, frustrating Mackensen's efforts to produce the encirclement and destruction of the Serbian army as an entity. But he could not hold the country. The specific texture of what fighting on the Serbian front looked like at the level of the individual soldier is documented in accounts that have almost never been translated into English. Serbian soldiers fighting the Austro-Hungarians in 1914 were dealing with a specific material disadvantage that shaped every engagement. They had almost no standardized equipment. Some units were equipped with modern rifles, others had older weapons. As many as a quarter of the men in some Serbian units marched to the front carrying shovels rather than firearms because there were not enough weapons to arm every soldier. The Austrian units facing them had 486 machine guns. The Serbian army had 200. In the opening weeks of the war, Serbian artillery quickly ran so low on ammunition that the guns fell almost silent, while the Austro-Hungarians were able to maintain sustained fire. Serbian casualties reached 100 men per day per division simply from attrition in the trenches, without any major engagement. What compensated for this material deficit was the specific tactical quality of the Serbian infantry. Veterans of 2 Balkan wars, men who had been fighting in this terrain for years, and understood it in ways that no Austrian soldier from Vienna or Budapest or Prague could quickly learn. The mountains and rivers of Serbia were not the obstacle for Serbian defenders that they were for Austrian attackers. The rugged terrain that made the country difficult to traverse was the terrain these men had grown up in. They knew which routes were passable and which were not, which ridgelines gave observation over which valleys, which river crossings were fordable in autumn and which were not. This knowledge was not in any Austrian military manual, it was in the bones of men who had been there all their lives. On November 23, 1915, the Serbian government and the Supreme Command made a joint decision. There would be no surrender. The army would retreat through the mountains of Montenegro and Albania to the Adriatic coast, where Allied ships would take them off. They would reconstitute and return. It was the only option that preserved Serbia as a fighting force and as a nation in exile. It was also, in terms of the human suffering it would produce, one of the most extraordinary decisions of the entire war. What became known in Serbian memory as the Albanian Golgotha, the Great Retreat, began in late November 1915. Approximately 220,000 soldiers and an estimated 200,000 civilians started the journey. What they were walking into was the Prokletice, the Accursed Mountains. That is the actual name. The Accursed Mountains of Albania, with a mean altitude of over 6,000 feet in the middle of winter, with 1 week's rations, without adequate cold weather gear, with roads that were barely tracks in the best conditions and were now buried under snow. The eyewitness accounts of the retreat are among the most extreme documents produced by the entire war on any front. A nurse who made the journey described what she saw. Every few hundred yards, we came on bodies of men frozen or starved to death. At one point, there were 4 in a heap. 2 other nearly naked bodies were evidently those of Serbian soldiers murdered by Albanians. She described the passes. A 2-foot track wound upwards. On the right were snow-covered cliffs, on the left a sheer drop to the river 1,000 feet below. 2 mules could not pass each other on that path, deep in snow or slippery with ice, and when a pack mule fell and died there, they froze and the trail passed over them. Men who reached the Albanian coast exchanged their weapons for food before the end. Soldiers sold their rifles for bread. The hunger was, as one account puts it, stronger than disgust. Men ate raw horse meat because it was all there was. Austrian aircraft dropped bombs on the retreating columns from the air. It was the first aerial bombardment of civilians in the history of warfare, and it was happening over a column of starving, freezing refugees in the Albanian mountains. King Peter I, 71 years old and nearly blind, made the journey in an ox cart. Field Marshal Putnik, who had been commanding the Serbian army from a heated room all year because he was too ill to visit the front, made the entire journey through the Albanian mountains in a sedan chair carried by his escort. He reached Scutari on December 7th. The image of this man, the architect of the victories at Ser and Kolubara, the strategic intelligence behind 2 years of Serbian resistance, being carried through the accursed mountains in a chair because he was too ill to walk, deserves to stand alongside any image the First World War has produced as a document of what that war cost the people who fought it. The specific quality of what the Albanian Golgotha felt like is preserved in a small number of eyewitness accounts from people who survived it and wrote about it, most of them foreign observers, nurses, doctors, journalists, attached to the Serbian forces. The accounts of Serbian soldiers themselves are fewer in English because translation has not happened, but what the foreign observers describe is consistent enough across multiple independent sources to produce a clear picture. The columns stretched for miles. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners, old men, children, ox carts loaded with whatever could be carried, horses and mules already weakening from underfeeding, all moving in the same direction, west, into the mountains, toward a coast that was weeks away in conditions that were worsening every day. The track, and in many places, it was only a track, a foot-wide path through snow and ice above cliff drops of hundreds of feet, was not wide enough for the volume of human traffic trying to move along it. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per hour. Animals that fell and died were frozen where they lay, and the column walked over them. The cold was the specific enemy of the retreat in a way that enemy action was not. Frostbite took more men than Bulgarian bullets. Men who stopped moving for too long in the temperatures of the Albanian passes in December 1915 and January 1916 did not start moving again. The accounts describe men sitting down by the side of the track, not from enemy fire, not from wounds, but from cold and exhaustion and hunger and the specific point at which a human body stops being willing to continue. Once a man sat down in those temperatures, he did not get up. The bodies of men who had simply stopped were present in the accounts at every stage of the mountain crossing. 2 here, 4 there, a group of 5 near a pass where the cold was particularly ferocious. The Albanian irregular fighters who attacked the retreating columns added a dimension of danger that the cold and hunger did not have: unpredictability. The Prokletia had always been bandit country, and the presence of what appeared to be a defeated army carrying valuables and equipment was an opportunity that the local fighters understood. The attacks came at night primarily, hitting the flanks of the column, seizing what could be taken, disappearing back into the mountains. Serbian soldiers, who had been fighting major European powers for 2 years, found themselves also fending off hit-and-run attacks from men who knew the mountain terrain better than anyone alive and whose objectives were not military but predatory. Among the soldiers who made the retreat was a specific category of human being whose story almost no account of the Albanian Golgotha adequately addresses. The Serbian army had taken with it every boy of military age it could find, young men born in 1896, 1897 and 1898, between the ages of 14 and 17, taken from their homes and put in the retreating columns so that the enemy could not conscript or kill them, so that they could become the next generation of the army when they were old enough. Approximately 43,000 boys started the retreat. 36,000 of them died in the mountains. Of the original 43,000, only 7,192 reached Bizerte in North Africa, the secondary evacuation point, on May 26, 1916. The death rate among the boys was nearly 85%. They died of cold and hunger and disease in the attacks of Albanian irregular fighters, and there is no monument to them outside Serbia, and almost no account of the Serbian front mentions them. Of the approximately 400,000 people who began the Great Retreat, approximately 120,000 soldiers and 60,000 civilians reached the Adriatic coast. The rest died in the mountains or were captured. The French Navy deployed 87 liners and hospital ships, escorted by 70 warships, to take the survivors off the Albanian shore. I want to give you the island of Vido, because I think it is one of the specific places in this entire story that deserves to be visited in the mind before we move on. The island of Corfu received the survivors of the Albanian Golgotha through January and February 1916. The French Navy, which had deployed 87 liners and hospital ships escorted by 70 warships to take the survivors off the Albanian shore, brought approximately 120,000 soldiers and 60,000 civilians across the Adriatic. The men who arrived at Corfu were in a condition that the French medical officers who received them described with a clinical precision that has not lost its force. They were skeletal. Many could not stand without assistance. Their feet were frostbitten. Their clothes were rags. Some had been walking barefoot through the Albanian mountains for weeks because their boots had disintegrated or been sold for food. The island of Vido, a small islet in the harbour off Corfu, was designated as the quarantine and treatment facility for the most seriously ill. The rationale was straightforward: put the men most likely to die somewhere separate from the main camp to reduce the risk of epidemic spread to the rest of the survivors. What this meant in practice was that the men on Vido were the men who were dying, and they died in large enough numbers that the medical staff eventually ran out of capacity to bury them. The bodies of the men who died on Vido were committed to the sea. the channel between Vido and Corfu that became known as the Blue Graveyard. The Serbian poet Milutin Bojic, who had survived the retreat, wrote Plava Grobnica, Blue Graveyard, to commemorate his comrades who had died at Vido. He himself contracted tuberculosis and died. He was buried in the Blue Graveyard. The poem is considered one of the finest works of Serbian literature and is almost entirely unknown outside Serbia. The dead at Vido have a memorial today. It stands on the island. The inscription reads, "Here, in the deep blue sea, rest the remains of Serbian warriors who fell for freedom and their fatherland. The exact number of men who rest in the Blue Graveyard is not known. They were too many to count accurately at the time, and the records from that period are incomplete. They died at Vido the same way they had died in the Albanian mountains, from cold, starvation, typhus, the accumulated physical destruction of months of retreat, and the sea received them as the mountains had received the rest." Now, the specific human beings. Because numbers at this scale, 160,000 civilian dead, 77,000 soldier dead in the retreat alone, defeat comprehension without the specific weight of individual people to anchor them. I want to stop here and give you Milunka Savic properly because her story is genuinely one of the most remarkable individual stories of the entire war on any front, and I think most people reading about her for the first time will feel the same way I did when I first came across her. Milunka Savic was born on June 28, 1892, in the village of Koprivnica near Novi Pazar in the southwest of Serbia. The same date, 22 years later, on which Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated in Sarajevo and the war would begin. In 1912, when the First Balkan War started and her brother received his call-up papers for mobilization, he was ill with tuberculosis and could not serve. Milunka Savic cut her hair, put on men's clothing and went in his place. She named herself Milun Savic. She was accepted without question, because nothing in her bearing or manner suggested anything other than a young Serbian man ready to fight. She was promoted to corporal after the Battle of Bregalnica, and it was only when a Bulgarian grenade wounded her on her 10th combat mission in 1913 that the doctors treating her discovered she was a woman. Her commanding officer, faced with this situation, offered her a transfer to the nursing corps. She stood at attention and told him she would only serve her country as a combatant soldier. He said he would give her his answer the next day. She said, "I will wait." She remained standing at attention in front of him. He relented after 1 hour and sent her back to the infantry. She served through the rest of the Balkan Wars and into the First World War, fighting as a woman under her own name once her gender was established, because Serbia was one of the few armies in the world that permitted this. During the Battle of Kolubara in December 1914, she crossed no man's land alone, threw grenades into Austrian trenches and captured 20 Austrian soldiers single-handedly. When her commander asked afterwards who deserved the Karađorđe Star with swords, Serbia's highest military decoration, the entire regiment answered simultaneously with her name. She received the decoration a second time in 1916 at the Battle of Crna-Bend, when she captured 23 Bulgarian soldiers on her own. She was wounded 9 times in total across her military career. Her decorations, 2 Karađorđe Stars with swords, 2 Legions d'Honneur from France, the Croix de Guerre with gold palm, the only woman in the entire First World War to receive it, the Cross of St. George from Russia, the Order of St. Michael from Britain. 12 medals in total from 4 countries earned in combat over 6 years of continuous warfare. What happened to Milunka Savic after the war is the part of her story that I find hardest to read, because of what it says about how countries treat the people who bled for them. After the war, she was given her first formal military rank, sergeant. She married a banker named Veliko Gligoric, had a daughter, and adopted 3 more children. Her husband eventually abandoned the family. She found work cleaning offices at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She then cleaned offices at the mortgage bank. She raised her daughter and her adopted children and the 32 other children she helped put through school on the salary of a government office cleaner. When the Second World War came and the Germans occupied Yugoslavia, she organised an infirmary in Belgrade, where she treated both partisan and Chetnik wounded. For this, the German-aligned police beat her bloody in front of her children and sent her to the concentration camp at Banjica, where she was scheduled to be shot. A German general recognised her, understood what he was looking at, and had her released. When the war ended and the commemorations began, Milunka Savic was there in her uniform. Officers came to speak with her and hear about what she had done. She was finally acquiring in her 60s the public recognition that she had not been given in her 40s and 50s. The French President Charles de Gaulle, when he visited Belgrade, requested a specific list of Serbian veterans to invite to meet him. Of all the Serbian veterans of the First World War, he invited only one to his presidential inauguration. He invited Milunka Savic. The Belgian government had offered her a house in 1919. The French government had offered her a pension and an apartment. She had turned both down because she would not leave Serbia. In 1972, after a newspaper campaign highlighted her financial situation, the Belgrade City Assembly gave her a small apartment. She died the following year, October the 5th, 1973, aged 81. She was reburied in Belgrade's Alley of the Greats in 2013, 40 years after her death. She is the most decorated female combatant in the recorded history of human warfare. She was a government office cleaner. I also want to give you Flora Sanders, because she is one of the most extraordinary British figures of the entire war, and she is almost completely unknown in Britain. She was born in Yorkshire in 1876, the youngest daughter of a rector, and she arrived in Serbia in August 1914 with a St. John ambulance unit of 36 women. By the time the retreat into Albania began in late 1915, she had been through the typhus epidemic, treated thousands of wounded soldiers, and crossed the boundary from nurse to soldier in the way that the specific chaos of the Serbian war made possible. When her medical unit reached terrain that ambulances could not navigate, she removed the Red Cross badge from her arm and asked to join the 2nd Infantry Regiment as a private. The colonel took the small brass regimental badges from his own epaulets and fastened them to her shoulder straps. That was her enlistment. She was the only British woman officially to serve as a combat soldier in the First World War. In November 1916, during the Serbian advance on Monastir, she was caught in hand-to-hand combat and seriously wounded by a grenade. The specific clinical description of her injuries, 28 shrapnel wounds, from knee to shoulder on the right side of her body, her right arm shattered and badly lacerated. Bleeding and unconscious, she was rescued by a lieutenant who crawled out under fire to drag her back to safety. Her blood dripped through the stretcher onto the ground as she was carried to the first aid station. She received Serbia's highest military decoration, the Order of the Karađorđe's Star, while recovering from those wounds. She returned to the front in May 1917. She was still in the Serbian army in 1922. There is a road named after her in Belgrade. The only British memorial to her is a plaque in the village church in Suffolk where she grew up. The Serbian army reconstituted at Corfu through the first half of 1916. The men who had survived the Albanian Golgotha were fed, rested, re-equipped with Allied weapons and ammunition, and transferred to the Macedonian front, a stretch of mountainous terrain running east to west through what is now North Macedonia, Greece, and Bulgaria. The Salonika front, as it was known in Allied capitals, was deeply unpopular with Allied strategists who considered it a waste of resources too far from the decisive theatre. The soldiers who served there called it the birdcage, because they were surrounded by neutral Greek territory and could go nowhere. The Salonika front had been called the birdcage since 1915, and the British and French press had called the forces there the gardeners of Salonika, men wasting their time in an inactive theatre while the real war happened in France. Winston Churchill called Salonika a strategic error. Lloyd George called for its abandonment. The Germans and Bulgarians who faced the Allied Army of the Orient across the Macedonian front lines took a different view. They kept approximately 600,000 soldiers on the Macedonian front throughout 1917 and 1918. Soldiers who were not on the Western Front, not reinforcing the lines in France, not available for the spring offensive of 1918. The birdcage, whatever the Allied critics thought of it, was tying down a significant fraction of the Central Powers' military capacity, in a theatre that those powers took seriously even when their opponents did not. By 1918, the Salonika front had grown to include Serbian, French, British, Greek, Italian and Russian contingents. General Franchet Desperay, who had taken command of the Allied Army of the Orient in June 1918, was planning the offensive that would become Dobro Pol. He identified the weakest point of the Bulgarian line, the high ground around Dobro Pol in central Macedonia, and concentrated his best forces against it. The plan called for a surprise assault in terrain that the defenders had believed was too difficult for a major offensive. The Serbian and French forces would climb the mountains at night and strike at dawn. The Salonika front deserves a specific account of what it was like to serve on it, because the standard history tends to present it as an inactive theatre. The front line in Macedonia ran through some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. Limestone mountains with few roads, extreme summer heat and bitter winter cold, river valleys that flooded seasonally and turned the ground into a swamp. The British forces at Salonika suffered 4 times more casualties from disease than from enemy action. Malaria was endemic, dysentery was ubiquitous. The Serbian forces, fighting on the western sector of the Macedonian front, were consistently the most aggressive element of the Allied army of the Orient. They had something the other contingents lacked. They were fighting toward home. Every mile of ground gained on the Macedonian front was a mile closer to Serbia. The French were fighting for an alliance. The British were fighting out of obligation. The Serbs were fighting for the country whose mountains they could see from their positions on the right days, across the Bulgarian lines, in the blue distance to the north. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a documented military reality. The formations that fight toward their own territory fight differently from formations that fight on behalf of obligations and alliance structures, and the Serbian performance on the Macedonian front from 1916 to 1918 is the specific evidence for that proposition. It was here in the mountains of Macedonia on September 15, 1918, that the Serbian front produced the battle that ended the First World War. The Battle of Dobro Pole. Most people who know a great deal about the First World War have not heard of it. Most people who know about it cannot fully explain why it matters. Military historians who have studied it closely have increasingly argued that Dobro Pole, not the 100 Days Offensive in the West, was the decisive blow that brought the war to an end. Here is the chain of causation, which is documented and unambiguous. On September 15, 1918, French and Serbian forces under General Louis Franchet d'Espèrey launched a surprise offensive against the Bulgarian positions on the high ground around Dobro Pole in central Macedonia. The Serbian shock corps, including the elite Sumadija division, led the assault. The Bulgarian defensive line was shattered. The attack had generated fewer than 5,000 Allied casualties. The breakthrough was complete. What followed happened at a pace that the static fronts of the First World War had not produced since 1914. 2 days after Dobro Pole fell, Allied forces had carved a salient 6 miles deep and 20 miles wide into the Bulgarian lines. 10 days after the offensive began, Serbian forces captured Gradsko, the main communication centre for all Central Powers forces on the Macedonian front. German commanders could no longer coordinate with their Bulgarian counterparts. On September 29th, French and Serbian forces captured Skopje. On September 29th, Bulgaria capitulated and signed an armistice. Before I close, I want to make the case for Dobro Pole properly, because I genuinely believe it is the most underrated military event of the entire First World War, and I think most people who hear about it for the first time will find the argument compelling. The Western Front in September 1918 was advancing. The 100 Days Offensive, the series of Allied attacks that began at Amiens on August 8, 1918, was pushing the German lines back and had broken through in several sectors. The German army was retreating under pressure, and the High Command understood that the war could not be won. But the German army in France in September 1918 was still a coherent fighting force. It was retreating to shorter, more defensible lines. Hindenburg and Ludendorff believed in early September 1918 that the Western Front could be stabilized. Not won, but stabilized long enough to negotiate a peace that preserved something. On September 29, 1918, Bulgaria surrendered. The Bulgarian armistice exposed Austria-Hungary's entire southern flank. It opened a route through the Balkans that threatened Germany's connection to its Ottoman ally. It created a potential Allied advance northward through the Balkans toward Germany's southern border. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, on September 30th, told the German government that the strategic situation had changed overnight and that peace must be sought immediately. The armistice request went out on October 4th. The war ended on November 11th. The chain from Dobro Pole, September 15th to 17th, to the armistice, November 11th, runs through Bulgaria's collapse. Bulgaria collapsed because Serbian and French soldiers broke the line in Macedonia. The battle that produced it was fought by men who had walked out of the Albanian mountains with nothing and had spent 2 years on the Macedonian front, fighting their way back toward a country they could see on the right days in the blue distance to the north. General Oskar Potiorek, the man who had failed at Sarajevo and failed 3 times in Serbia, was retired after the Battle of Kolubara and never commanded troops again. He lived until 1933, long enough to see the empire he had served dissolve and the war he had helped cause conclude in total defeat for the Central Powers. Konrad von Hötzendorf, who had planned the punitive expedition that would defeat Serbia in 3 months and watched it fail 3 times in 1914, survived the war and retired to Austria. King Peter I of Serbia, who had carried a rifle to the front in December 1914, died in Belgrade in 1921 at the age of 77. He is buried in the Church of St. George at Oplenac. Field Marshal Radomir Putnik did not live to see Dobro Pol. He died in Nice on May 17, 1917, at 70 years of age, of lung emphysema. He had been dismissed from command in January 1916, informed of his dismissal by a cashier who handed him his salary without the Chief of General Staff's supplement, which is how he discovered he had been removed from his position. He travelled to Nice, where the French government welcomed him with honours and provided him with a villa. He died without seeing his homeland again. His remains were returned to Serbia in 1926 and buried at Belgrade's new cemetery. The inscription on his grave reads, "Grateful homeland to Radomir Putnik." I want to say something at the end about what happened to Serbia's memory of this war, because I think it's important. The First World War gave Serbia Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes proclaimed in December 1918, and in doing so created a new country on top of the ruins of the old one. The Serbian soldiers who had survived 4 years of the most extreme experience any nation's military went through in that war came home to a country that was being remade around them. The specific Serbian memory of the war and the Albanian Golgotha, the triple invasion and the triple repulse, the sacrifice of Ser and Kolubara, the boys who died in the mountains, the blue graveyard off Corfu, Milunka Savic and Flora Sandes, and Radomir Putnik in his sedan chair, all of this was folded into the larger Yugoslav narrative of South Slavic unity, diluted, made to serve a political purpose that was not its own. Outside Serbia, the memory barely existed at all, and I think that's where we come in. You can consider yourself a serious student of the First World War and still not know about the Battle of Ser, the first Allied victory of the entire war. You can know about Verdun and Passchendaele and the Somme and have no idea that a 71-year-old king nearly blind took a rifle and walked to the front in December 1914 and turned the battle around. You can know about the poets of the Western Front, Owen, Sassoon, Brooke, and not know that Serbia had its own war poet who survived the retreat and died of tuberculosis in the Blue Graveyard. You can study the end of the First World War and not know that the battle which triggered the collapse of the Central Powers was fought by Serbian soldiers on a front that Allied newspapers called a sideshow. The 25% statistic sits at the top of this account, and it should sit there. 25% of mobilized soldiers dead. France lost 16.8%. Germany 15.4%. The country that proportionally paid the highest price in military dead was a country of 4.5 million people fighting for its survival against empires, and it paid that price in full, and then it went back and broke the line that ended the war, and the world moved on and forgot.